Well, good morning and welcome, everyone. My name is Bren Carlill, and I am the Director of Public Affairs at the Zionist Federation of Australia. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I speak, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. Knowing that this conversation is being watched in every Australian state, I would also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of all the lands on which people are watching this. Our guest this morning is Ambassador Dennis Ross. Dennis is the William Davidson Distinguished Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, and he has been heavily involved in US Middle East policy for many years. On the Israeli-Palestinian and wider Israeli-Arab peace processes, Dennis Ross was the chief negotiator for the US for both the George H.W. Bush and the Clinton administrations. He also served for 2.5 years as a special advisor in the Obama administration. During the Clinton administration, Dennis helped shape the 1994 Israel-Jordan Peace Treaty, the 1995 Israeli-Palestinian Interim Agreement, the 1997 Hebron Accord, and worked hard trying to achieve Israeli-Syrian peace. He was also at Camp David during the failed July 2000 talks. His book, The Missing Piece, which is somewhere on the bookshelf behind me, offers us an in-depth, behind-the-scenes, blow-by-blow account of those very intense 7 years of peacemaking. He is also the author of numerous other books, including this one, Be Strong and of Good Courage, which provides the profiles of 4 key Israeli leaders who had to take immensely difficult and important decisions for the good of the country. Dennis, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
I want to cast you in a Dickensian role of the ghosts of Christmases past, present, and future as we talk about Israeli-Palestinian relations. So we'll jump straight into the past. And obviously, hindsight can provide us with a clarity that is often impossible to achieve when events are in motion. But notwithstanding that, can I ask you to look back at the Oslo process? It ultimately failed to produce peace, but it laid the foundations for peace. And if we look back through all the hope and the uncertainty and the societal divisions of the 1990s, do you think that peace as envisioned by Oslo was ever achievable? Or were one or both societies or leaderships just not ready for it?
As you might imagine, it's a question I've wrestled with for a long time. On the one hand, when I've looked back, there's a number of lessons I've learned about why it was so difficult, why the process was so difficult. The process was based on basically an assumption. The assumption was taking on what I'll call the narrative issues, meaning the history, the stories that each side tell themselves, the essence of what defines each side's identity, the way they sort of look at themselves and what their aspirations are, the kind of history and mythologies that are bound up with that. The logic was you couldn't take on the narrative issues like Jerusalem and refugees because it was too hard, because each side was being asked to give up too much in terms of who they were and their identities. And I do believe at a certain level that was right. Now, the problem was that you then wanted to create an incremental step-by-step approach. And the logic was that each side, as they learned to live together and as coexistence became natural, and as in a sense, the network of relationships built, and even the infrastructure of coexistence was developed further, that then you could take on these narrative issues that went to the heart of self-definition and identity. Now, the good news about that was, at least logically, it was right. And there were signs of the two sides, at least for a few years, developing that kind of relationship. The bad news was that it gave a lot of time and space to enemies of this process on both sides. On the Palestinian side, basically what really did this process was terrorist bombings. The Hamas basically was an enemy of this process from the beginning, and it did everything it could to subvert it. On the Israeli side, you had those who kept pushing for, let's acquire more land, let's build more settlements. Palestinians found the settlements, the expansion of settlements, as something that seemed to contradict what this process was supposed to be about. And for Palestinians, it made them feel powerless. Now, you can't morally equate settlement building with terrorist bombing. They're not the same. Those who were engaging in terrorist bombing were deliberately trying to kill peace. Those who were building settlements were trying to stop a possible outcome that they didn't favor, where you're giving up part of the land. I think we had to find a way to change one element of this approach. The idea of doing it step by step made sense, but we needed more demonstrations of success. We needed more demonstrations that living together and cooperating in cooperative projects paid off for both sides. We needed to build the credibility of peacemaking so that we could insulate it from those who were trying to subvert it. Now, we didn't do enough of that. The US, should have been tougher on Arafat when he didn't do enough to stop terrorist actions. And we should have been tougher with Israelis on not building because it was kind of preempting what the process could produce. So when I look back, I think we needed to do more with both sides to condition them on the kind of steps they could be, the kind of steps that were necessary in a positive way, not just preventing the negatives, but in a positive way. What more could be done so that also each leader would give the other more space to make hard decisions? The political space narrowed in a sense for each side because the kind of actions weren't done to reinforce peacemaking. And then you had the enemies of peace who did everything they could to subvert it. And they played on each other. They played in the extremes on each side, reinforced each other. So we had to overcome a lot. And in retrospect, I still think we might have succeeded if we had done more of the things I was just describing. But also when we finally got to the summits, we shouldn't have gone for summits like Camp David unless we had a demonstration from each side that they were prepared to take really hard steps for them. What I mean by this is, if you say to leaders, are you prepared to make the kind of tough historic decisions? And you know what? They'll always say yes. But that means nothing. You basically have to identify for each side, all right, here are the steps that will prove you're prepared to do something that's hard for you. And the value of getting them to take those kinds of steps, which they know will produce a backlash, is they then have a huge stake in being able to achieve something quickly so they can show, okay, this justifies the concession I made. And I can get into some of the specifics on each side. But I mean, these are some of the lessons I learned over time as I look back.
I want to touch on one of the things that you mentioned about the enemies of peace, because I think, and I'll probably keep touching on this, especially as we talk about the future, because there's always been a significant, regardless of the tactics that they use, there's always been a significant portion of both Israeli and Palestinian societies that don't want to divide the land. And whether or not that's because of their interpretation of their religion or for other reasons, they don't want to divide the land. If we look at the Northern Irish peace process, and I remember reading a journalist, I think his name was Taylor, who wrote a lot about it. And he said, basically that peace wasn't possible until both sides were sick of killing and sick of dying. And there was like a societal realization that they wanted peace. So is peace even possible between Israelis and Palestinians, as long as there is a significant number of people on both sides that fundamentally don't want it?
Look, I think it's a critically important question. In the literature, the negotiating literature, there's something known as a mutually hurting stalemate. William Zartman has written about that. And the idea of a mutually hurting stalemate is that both sides feel that the price of the conflict is just too high. And you have to get to the point where both sides feel that way. We have rarely ever had what I would describe as something that really reflects that between Israelis and Palestinians. We've had one side or the other being uncomfortable, but we haven't been each side being so uncomfortable that the status quo was unacceptable and the price of the status quo was seen as being too high. And I think it's, peacemaking doesn't emerge just because you have a convergence on the negative, but it's probably an essential condition to get each side to think about, okay, I'm prepared to do some things that are hard because of it. Now, in the case of the Israelis, what produced Oslo was Rabin's sense of two important realities. One, the first Intifada, where it became clear that Palestinians were not simply going to accept an enduring situation where they were under control of the Israelis, under the occupation of Israelis. And there wasn't a military answer to this. And Rabin also looked at the effect he felt it was having on the IDF. The IDF was being turned into a police force. Now, this was a guy who didn't intend to make his career in the military. That was never his intent. He was going to be an agronomist. He actually won a fellowship before the War of Independence to study at UC Berkeley, and he was actually going to be in what was there. They had an agronomy program. He was going to become a water engineer. By the way, years later, he would show me with great pride this little watering system he created on the top of his building. He said, this is what I wanted to do. Now I tell you the story because the cost of the War of Independence, and he was the head of the Harel Brigade. He was responsible for breaking the siege on Jerusalem. He lost half of his brigade, half. And it had a searing effect on him. It affected him his whole life. It made him decide, I won't leave the military because we weren't prepared enough for this war. I need to stay in and build the military so we never face that again. So here was the IDF was an institution that he helped to build. And he looked at it, the cost of the first Intifada on the morale and even the training, the readiness, and the idea that soldiers are being turned into policemen. And this had a huge effect on him. So for him, he became a believer in peace, but obviously there had to be sufficient security to provide the insurance against what if this went wrong. For the Palestinians, if you look at why did Arafat go into Oslo, it was not because the consequence of the stalemate with the Israelis was so great. It was because he made the wrong decision and backed Saddam Hussein. And he therefore, all the PLO had all of its finances cut off. And they were isolated in the Arab world. And he was a bit player. The first Intifada he didn't create. It was the Palestinians in the territories who created it. So he had to make himself relevant, and he had to restore the basis for being a player. And that's what Oslo was. There was a negative, but it wasn't the negative of the same sort. It wasn't the negative that says, I need to solve this conflict because the price of the conflict is so high. So he was coming in for what I'll call instrumental reasons. Rabin was coming in because Rabin believed, okay, we have to settle this conflict. When he gave the speech he gave at the White House on September 13th, 1993, and he said, enough of blood and tears. Here was a guy who had a hard time shaking Arafat's hand. I mean, this is a guy I can tell you, having known Rabin and worked with him closely, he could not lie. I mean, he could not lie. But that didn't mean he didn't always tell the full truth. He could tell the technical truth, but he could never lie. And at the ceremony at the White House, he couldn't disguise what he felt about Arafat because, he knew Arafat had been responsible for acts of terror, including things like Ma'alot, where you had, a couple dozen school kids killed. And it was emotionally difficult for him to shake Arafat's hand. But then he gave a speech of outreach to Palestinians that was unbelievable. Arafat's speech was not a speech of outreach to Israelis. It was a speech of justification to his own public of why he was there. So you didn't have in a sense, what you were describing, you had enough convergence to create limited agreements. I'm not sure there was ever enough to end the conflict, which was the problem for Arafat. Now, I will say, Arafat was someone who did come to respect and admire Rabin. And had Rabin not been assassinated, the question is, would that have been enough? Rabin, when he would take steps that he knew would be hard for Arafat, he would use a private channel that he had to Arafat, who was Yossi Ginnisar, who was from the Shin Bet and who knew Arafat well, and who was close to Arafat. And he would say to him, look, I'm going to take the following step, and I realize it's going to create a problem for you. Tell me what I can do to ease the price for you. And Arafat came to look at Rabin in a way that said, okay, when he said he was my partner, Arafat came to look at him as a partner. Now, was that enough to get Arafat to do what I think was very hard for him to do, psychologically, emotionally, end the conflict? I'm not sure, because the conflict itself defined him. The struggle defined him. This is a guy who wore his keffiyeh in the shape of Palestine. This is a guy who, when I did the Hebron deal, it took 2 23-day shuttles around the clock to close it. And the night after I closed it, I was down having dinner with him, just the two of us alone. And I said to him, look, I'm going to go on vacation. And he says, do you really have to go on vacation? And I go, yeah, I need to go on vacation. And he says to me, it must be nice to take a vacation. So I said, well, you could use one. And he says, look, my last vacation was in 1962. So I said, you could really use one. And he says to me, and understand, there's nobody else in the room. And I've been living with the guy. There's nobody to impress. He says, how can I take a vacation from my people? Huh. The conflict defined him. Mm-hmm. And we were asking him to end the conflict. He could do limited deals. But I think for him, ending the conflict was a bridge too far. Mm. And we needed to, in a sense, restructure what we were doing to shape the conditions for what could be done after him. We didn't do enough of that. We tried to go for the full thing, to be fair, partly because we were being pushed by the Israelis to go for the full thing.
Yep, true. If we jump to the present, and I think we'll be jumping back and forth between the present and a possible future, because there's enough things happening there. There are enough clues in the present now that really portend what a future might be. Stepping slightly away from the direct Israeli-Palestinian negotiations, I want to talk about the importance of a personal relationship between the Israeli Prime Minister and US President. Now, over the years, you've seen quite a few combinations of Israeli Prime Minister and US President. You've seen them up close. You've written a whole book about the relationship that each administration has had with Israel. And I don't want to simplify things too much, but how important is that personal relationship between the two leaders? Or are shared interests and shared values enough to keep the relationship going?
Personal relations count for something. The key thing that they count for is they develop trust. Leaders who trust each other will do things that they wouldn't do under other circumstances. Now, will they sacrifice their national interest? No. But will they stretch in a way they wouldn't otherwise? Will they do something that would be harder for them than they would do otherwise? Yes. There were relations, and I think through, and obviously I see the book I wrote called Doomed to Succeed, which does provide what each administration, each president's relationship,
somewhere here as well,
right? Yeah. With their Israeli prime minister, their counterparts. There were presidents for whom the emotional connection to Israel guaranteed a relationship with the prime minister. There were presidents that you take someone like Jimmy Carter, who did not have that connection at all, and didn't have a connection with Begin. Somehow they still did Camp David, but it wasn't because there was trust between the two. It was because Sadat changed the circumstances by going to Jerusalem, and it made it possible. There were presidents like Bill Clinton, who emotionally was committed to Israel. I mean, he had an instinctive emotional attachment to Israel, and it came through. And now with Rabin, he looked at Rabin to start with as someone who was worthy of great respect. Over time, he came to admire him. And in a lot of ways for Clinton, Rabin was what he hoped to be, meaning he kind of revered who Rabin was. He was a soldier who became a statesman. He was a fighter for his country, literally and figuratively. He was the sort of the lived experience of Israel, and Clinton, who was a student of history and who believed in Israel, he was drawn to Rabin. I mean, it was striking how he was drawn to Rabin, and there just was a high level of trust. And Rabin, you know, I won't say that he looked at Clinton the way Clinton looked at him, but he understood, okay, I have an American partner. And Rabin, having been the Israeli ambassador to the United States, he had developed a deep belief in the relationship with the United States and its importance. I mean, one of the things that divided he and Shimon Peres in earlier days is Peres gravitated towards the French at a time when the US wasn't prepared to provide security assistance to Israel, but the French were. Rabin at the time felt the answer for us is not France. The answer for us is the United States.
He thought that
even before he came as the ambassador. And he came, interestingly enough, in 1963. There was a dialogue, partly because of, John Kennedy was the first American president to feel that we had to change the way we dealt with Israel. Harry Truman, recognized Israel, 11 minutes after its declaration over the opposition of his entire national security establishment. But he didn't do a lot as president with Israel beyond that. There was no provision of arms. There was only minimal economic assistance, really minimal economic assistance. We didn't even recognize Israel in a legal de jure sense until after the first election of the Knesset. So it's like February 1, 1949. We had de facto recognition immediately, but we didn't move to de jure recognition until 1949. Eisenhower was very negative. He saw Israel as costing us in the Middle East. Kennedy is the first one who really begins to change the way he thinks about it. And one of the elements of that is that he decides, in addition to selling arms to Israel for the first time, he decides there should be a strategic discussion. And Rabin is one of those who comes in 1963, in the fall of 63, before the assassination. And he's here for several days for strategic discussions with people from the Pentagon.
What was his,
it colors his view.
What was he doing in 63, Rabin? Where was he in the...
He was in the military. It was right before he was a major general. He was a likely successor to become chief of staff, but he wasn't chief of staff yet. And he was sort of head of planning at the time. And so he came under that, with that hat. But it just cemented his view, the quintessential partner that Israel needed on the world stage was the United States. So having an American president who he saw was a believer in Israel and was attached to Israel, for him, he wanted to develop that.
I mean, you've dealt with Benjamin Netanyahu for many years, and his reputation is always that he's been slow to act, or he acts with caution. And I think arguably the policies of his current government and the way that they have been implemented since he's come back to power is not like the cautious Bibi of old. I mean, you could even characterize them as reckless. What are your thoughts on this new Bibi and the rush to, I mean, I mean, we can talk about the judicial reforms, but I mean, we've just seen in the last week the move to create new settlement housing. And
Look, I think to understand Bibi, of course, he has an ideological view of what Israel needs, but he's always combined that with a high degree of pragmatism. Uh, if you look at Bibi, he always had governments where he had people to his left as well as to his right. This is the first government that he only has people to his right. He is a master at maneuver among those when he has maneuvering room. In fact, he could teach a master class on that. Now he doesn't have maneuvering room. The center left refused to be part of a government with him, and so he formed a government with those who would form a government with him. Now, one could say he also legitimized people on the fringe, people like Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, who are extreme. And in the end, becoming prime minister and forming the government was obviously the most important thing for him. But now he's prime minister in a circumstance where he has much less maneuvering room. Now, having said that, this is a government that, because of the way they made the decisions on judicial reform, the seeming approach that they were going to jam it down the throats of everybody, that has produced a backlash. And it's a backlash that involves probably 70% of the country. I mean, it's just astounding to see. You have people who are demonstrating who never would have dreamed to demonstrate before, ever. But they're out there 24 weeks in a row. And you go to Jerusalem, the people who are out demonstrating, they have kippah. You go to Tel Aviv, they don't, but they're every age group. It's not one class of people. I like to say about Israel that 70% usually can't agree on whether it's day or night. And yet, here they are. You look at the polling, 70% want there to be a compromise and have reacted negatively to a process that looked like it was simply going to be imposed by fiat. So we've seen Bibi pause that effort because of the reaction of the country. We now see him again trying to push parts of it because he's under tremendous pressure from his Minister of Justice, Yariv Levin, and the chairman of the Constitution Law and Justice Committee in the Knesset, Simcha Rothman. They want something of the judicial reform to go through. He seems to have picked what he believes is the least controversial of the provisions. He gave an interview to the Wall Street Journal where he said the override provision, which was one of the more, probably the one that was the most anti-democratic element of the group, because there is no separation of powers in Israel other than having the judiciary. You have a parliamentary system, so as long as the government has a majority in the Knesset, whatever the prime minister wants, he's going to get through, unless the coalition collapses. So the Supreme Court's the only break on executive power. There is no legislative break on executive power. And one of the elements was an override provision with a majority of 61, meaning any government by definition had that majority. So with a bare majority, they could override whatever the Supreme Court did. And he's just said there's no supermajority. He says he's pulled it. That's off the table. That's not even in consideration. Now, for most of the opposition, the issue has become the judges' selection committee, because the political criteria for the judges is seen as trying to cook the books. So, okay, you'll control the Supreme Court because you're going to be able to appoint people who will do what you want. And so even though there isn't an override provision, you're still going to end the independence of the judiciary because you're basically going to cook the books. I think Bibi is trying to step back and produce a compromise on that as well. they're trying to push now the idea of the reasonableness standard. When Aharon Barak was the president of the Supreme Court, he created the reasonableness standard and created a kind of very broad liberal interpretation of it. And what the reasonableness standard was is that if on the basis of a standard of reasonableness, there is an appointment made of a minister, or there is a law that is adopted by the Knesset, and either one of these doesn't pass the reasonableness test, the Supreme Court can disqualify it. Now, the problem is that's a fairly elastic definition. And so the question is, can you circumscribe the definition or have it apply to only certain classes of issues? And there's been sort of a move in that direction, but not enough. So I find that it's kind of a long-winded answer to your question, but you have Bibi operating in an environment where this is a government that, on the one hand, wants the judicial change because they have an agenda. In the case of the religious parties, they want to neuter the Supreme Court so the Haredi don't have to go into the army. And in the case of Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, they want to be able to annex the West Bank. They want to build as much as they can. You know, Smotrich wrote a treatise in 2017 where he said we need at least 1 million Israelis living in the West Bank, and then we will give the Arabs their choice. They can live, we can coexist, they will not be citizens, they won't have the same status as Israelis, and if that's not acceptable, they can leave. That was his treatise. And the truth, that's what he believes. This is not a case of him pursuing something that he thinks is politically, good for him. This is a case he believes it, and he wants to pursue policies to that end. Now, he would like to see the PA collapse, Palestinian Authority collapse. Bibi is saying publicly that's the last thing we want to see. But there's a tension because some of the actions that are being taken in the West Bank are weakening the PA to the point where it could collapse. So here again, you see a tension. I see a tension between Bibi trying to be pragmatic on the judicial reform process. I see a tension with him saying, we don't want the PA to collapse, but then policies that are making it difficult to sustain it, which is not to say that the PA, the Palestinian Authority, needs a thoroughgoing reform. I mean, it has lost its legitimacy because of its own behaviors. But what's happening now weakens it further.
In Be Strong and of Good Courage, in the book that I think it's your most recent book, where you profile the 4 Israeli leaders and the decisions they've made, you've highlighted one of the quotes that Sharon said about, his generation of political leaders. I don't want to misquote him, but basically they put the state first, whereas the next generation of politicians and they put politics first. I'm wondering how true that is versus if you are among the heroic founders of a state, you certainly have a bit more ability to make big decisions than if you are the next generation. And if you are a creature of politics and are still captured by politics, then you still have to make political decisions. But with that passing first generation gone, is it possible for those big, bold decisions to be made? And I'll get to the things that you said that Israel needs to do, read the Palestinians, in order to maintain some separation.
Sharon and I were having lunch, and lunch, any meal with Sharon was always interesting because he loved to eat. I mean, he really loved to eat.
Yeah.
I have a healthy appetite, but I said to him, I'm a minor leaguer compared to you. In the middle of this lunch, he says to me, my generation, he said, there's nobody left. It's only Shimon Peres and me. And he said, Shimon and I don't always agree, but Shimon is like me. We're the last generation that isn't afraid to make big decisions. And then he said, all the people after us, they're all politicians. They'll put their political needs and interests first. That's what he believed. And you know, the founders' generation, you can understand, they fought to create the state and then sustain it against all odds. And you know, it's not that the subsequent prime ministers haven't, or of the subsequent generation, didn't fight for the state. They did, but it's not the same because the state already existed, and its existence wasn't really in question. Whereas what Sharon was saying is, Peres, Rabin, we didn't know if we were gonna, you know, we knew we lived on the edge, and we had to fight tooth and nail to exist. And by the way, we were poor. You know, people don't remember how poor Israel was. You know, in the first few years, they were absorbing 1 million people from the Arab world who came with nothing because they were forced to leave. At that time, you know, Israel, you know, had less than a week's worth of foodstuffs. I mean, this is you know, it's hard to imagine, you know, how poor the state was to begin with. And so these were the guys who built the state. In answer to your question, there's a psychological dimension here that Sharon embodied, that in a sense was part of the DNA. And he was basically saying, this next generation, in effect, they had it much easier. They never had to question anything. They didn't live on the edge. And so they can't really have that DNA. No. Is that true? You're asking, is it true? He believed it. I have to say, I didn't really believe it. I believed that if we could create the right circumstances, we could get leaders to make the big decisions. But of course, the proof is in the pudding, and we haven't exactly seen it.
Well, I was going to say, if Ehud Barak had been successful in July 2000, he probably would have been an extra chapter in your book.
Yes, I think that's right. You know, one of the things about Barak is that he's defined himself as being Rabin's successor. And I would say he was not fully that way. And the reason I would say that is, while he was prepared to make big moves, he was, but he wouldn't live up to his commitments. His commitments tend to be situational. With Rabin, if he gave you his word, if it meant it was going to be the end of his political career, it didn't matter. He gave his word. Issue's over. With Barak, on the way to Camp David, he made a series of commitments, and he walked away from many of them. So, you know, would he have done the things he said with Syria? I'm convinced he would have, because he really viewed that through the strategic lens. With the Palestinians, you know, he made some big moves. To be fair, he did. He made some very big moves, but he also acted in a way that made it harder for the Palestinians to be responsive. And that's where, I mean, as I said, one of the things about Rabin was mindful of what was hard for them. One of the things that Rabin said to me was, look, I know we have to give up more than the other side, but I need to see that they're prepared to do things that are hard for them too. It can't be only us that has to do hard things. And so I guess what it comes back to is, I do think that creating the right circumstances, we could still see, at least on the Israeli side, we could see a leader who's prepared to make a big move on the Palestinian issue. It's increasingly hard, given the number of settlers, how far things have gone. Look, when we wrote the book, Be Strong and of Good Courage, I mean, the real purpose of the book was to get to the last chapter. The whole point was to say, okay, what an Israeli, and it really gets to the heart of your question, Israel needs a leader who understands that it has to make an excruciating decision. Because if you're going to have two states, you're going to have separation, And it means, at least, even if you're accepting the idea of settlement blocks, which is the only answer, settlement blocks on, say 6 to 8% of the West Bank closest to the Green Line. But then you gotta, even if, and by the way, 85% of all the Israeli settlers live across the Green Line in the area that's 8% of the West Bank closest to the Green Line. 85%. So it means that 92% of the West Bank, 15% of the settlers live there. And to make a deal, it's excruciating because you're going to have to affect that 15%. And, they are an important constituency. In a sense, you have to take them on. Well, that's a hard thing to do. And the more time goes by and the more embedded they are and the larger their numbers become, the harder it becomes. So the whole idea of that book was to say, this is a really tough political decision, but here were 4 leaders who were different ideologically. You look at Ben-Gurion, Begin, Rabin, and Sharon, they were different ideologically, but where they were similar, they defined leadership the same way. And they felt they assumed the responsibility of leadership, never defer a decision and expect your successor or lob it off on your successor. Each of them said, no, if there's a decision to be made, I'll make the decision. That's who they were. And they always put the state first, not their political fortune, when it came to big decisions. Ben-Gurion, Begin took on his own constituency to do Camp David and the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty. Rabin, Rabin came out of, he was Paul Muck, he was, he came out of the centrist part of labor, and he had to take on those within that part of labor that questioned fundamentally Oslo. It was not just Likud, it was a significant part of what I'll call the right wing of labor. Sharon, for sure, because he built the settlements and he's the guy who, he's the guy twice. In the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty in the Sinai, he's the guy who removed the settlements. And in Gaza, he's the guy who removed the settlements. This is the guy who built the settlements. And you read his speech to the Knesset when he says what it means for him to have to do this, how hard it is to have to do it. But at the end of the day, the state required this. So the profiles of these 4 leaders who were very different ideologically, they converged on what the role of leadership was. And the whole point of this book was to get to the last chapter that said, okay, here's what Israel's facing. And now it needs a prime minister who embodies the characteristics of these 4.
If we accept the fact that there's a possibility of stumbling past the point of no return, so to speak, in the West Bank, and it exists, and we know, I personally accept the need for Israel to act to prevent this, but we're still facing the reality of Palestinian objectives. Now, as we previously discussed, a significant number of Palestinians reject the 2-state outcome, and not because they think it's hopeless, although there's those as well, but because they don't see a future with Israel in it. And obviously Hamas is the physical embodiment of that, but there's plenty of other Palestinians. But other than that, I would argue that it seems that the Palestinian Authority has been actively working against the creation of an independent state, much less a viable state, since 2014. And there's, I don't know, there's certainly pressure on Israel to act, but is it possible for Israel to separate from the Palestinians if the Palestinians are just refusing to play ball?
Well, first of all, it's a very important question. And the answer is not obvious. When Sharon made the decision to withdraw from Gaza, I wrote an article I was asked by the Jerusalem Post to write an article after he announced the disengagement. And I wrote an article that said, look, I think as a principle, to declare your readiness to withdraw completely is very good. But to withdraw unconditionally is not smart. Because first of all, the implication is only Israel has responsibilities, not the Palestinians. And that's not right. Secondly, it's the equivalent of throwing the keys over the fence and hoping for the best. That doesn't make sense. And thirdly, you not only want the Palestinians to have to assume responsibility, but for Abu Mazen, who is the head of the PA, you want him to look like he's the one who produced the withdrawal. You don't want Hamas to look like their violence is what produced the withdrawal. You're strengthening the wrong forces. So I got a message from someone close to Sharon, who I knew well, who said, Prime Minister hated that article, and he hopes you won't do any more like that. And I said, well, too bad, because I will. But I had a relationship with Sharon, so the next time I was in Israel, I saw him, and I said, and I raised my concerns again, and I said, look, why couldn't you have said, I'm ready to get out, but we're going to have to negotiate the assumption of responsibilities by the Palestinians before we get out. First of all, that would have created a process for your withdrawal, but it would have put the onus on the Palestinians, which is where it should have been. If you're going to withdraw, the onus has to be on them to produce. And he said something that was quite profound to me. He said, and it gets to the heart of your question, he said, I cannot make our future dependent on their irresponsibility. Meaning, he didn't believe they would really assume the responsibilities. And he wasn't prepared to stay in Gaza if they wouldn't, because he was looking also at the demographic issue. He was increasing, much like Rabin, by the way. Rabin told me in February of 1995 that he was going to build a separation wall or barrier. And he said, I'm going to do it because I don't know if we can negotiate an outcome with the Palestinians, but I know we have to have a partition to preserve who we are. Sharon had the same view of the demographics, that he needed to get out of Gaza, first because it would buy time, but he was not going to get out of the West Bank, but he was going to withdraw. That's why he formed Kadima, because he knew he couldn't stay in Likud and be able to do that. So in a sense, both had a kind of insurance policy that if they couldn't negotiate an agreement, they would do it unilaterally to preserve Israel. And then they would create, they would act in a way that would ensure Israel from a security standpoint. Now, the question is, are we beyond that? Because the numbers make it, we're already very close to the point where it will be difficult to separate. So you may have to think about different models. The one thing for sure that I will say is anyone who thinks that a one-state outcome is stable, I would say, just look around the Middle East. Any place where there's a state that has more than one national identity, tribal identity, or sectarian identity, that state is either at war or completely paralyzed. So if you want Israelis and Palestinians to look like Lebanon or Syria or Iraq or Yemen or Libya, then you want one state. That's what the future is. So it can't be one state. And this is where people like Smotrich, who wants one state, they don't understand. You can't, you're not going to be able, you can't expel Palestinians. They're not going anywhere. And you need coexistence. And of course, to be fair, the Palestinians have to be prepared to coexist. Now, if you're talking to Palestinians, the average Palestinian will say, who's strong and who's weak? Who controls whom? We're not the threat to the Israelis. It's the threat is in the eye of the beholder. But the answer to that is, okay, but look at Hamas. Look at Islamic Jihad. There has to be, if you create the separation, then you're going to have security measures that guard against having a Palestinian state that isn't prepared to coexist. That's a fact.
Our time is almost up. I want to ask you two quick questions and then I'll let you go. And I know you're heading into the July 4 long weekend, so I'll let you enjoy that. The first question is about Palestinians in politics. And that is, there's people in there's 138 countries that have recognized the state of Palestine. Now, of course, there are only 2 Western democracies in that number, but there's people in the ruling Labour Party here in Australia that wants to add Australia's name to that list of countries that recognize Palestine. What do you think are the ramifications of a country like Australia recognizing Palestine? Obviously, unilaterally and not as part of a negotiated 2-state outcome.
Part of what needs to be done, if you're going to take a step that is of enormous symbolic value to the Palestinians. I don't dispute the fact that it's of enormous symbolic value to Palestinians. But to take that step when there's no behavior coming from the Palestinians that justifies it is a way of saying you don't have to be responsible and you'll still get things. Just as I said, I was very much in favor of what Sharon wanted to do in terms of getting out of Gaza. But I wanted there to be a duality of responsibility here. Today, the Palestinian Authority is not in a position to be a state because it is not building institutions. It is characterized by terrible corruption. There is no meaningful rule of law. There should be, if Australia wants to do it, the message to the Palestinians would be, we need to reform your system. Appoint an empowered prime minister who will look, we had Salam Fayyad in 2007. He did this. He did this for about 5 years. Mm-hmm. He basically came in at a time when there was complete lawlessness. He basically took care of security. He created transparency on economics. He built a kind of credible approach to creating a structure of institutions for a state. He said, let's take a page from the Zionists. They built a state from the ground up. Let us build a state from the ground up. Palestinians should be given symbols when they act on the substance to warrant being given the symbols. If Australia wants to do this, what the Labour Party there, what they want to do, or what they should say is, this is an objective of ours, but we need to see behaviors from the Palestinians that justifies this. Yeah. Hamas's behavior certainly doesn't justify it. And frankly, if you look at what the PA is today, it doesn't justify it. Now, that doesn't mean you can't start a conversation with them and say, fine, start a conversation with us as well. Let us define the circumstances under which we would recognize a Palestinian state. We will accept it as something that is an objective that we need to achieve. But it has to be characterized by the assumption of responsibilities by Palestinians too. Those who think that they're big friends of the Palestinians because they want to concede everything to them, I'll just tell you, I won't say who it was, but a senior Palestinian said, these people are not our friends because they don't require anything of us. We have to be held accountable. We have to be responsible. Otherwise, that'll never happen. Mm-hmm. So if you are a serious believer in a Palestinian state, and I want to see it, I want to see it first because I think there is such a thing as Palestinian nationalism. And I want to see it second, because I know that a one-state outcome is a disaster for Israel. And as a supporter and friend of Israel and a believer in Israel, I don't want Israel to adopt a posture that leads to a disaster. Mm. So a Palestinian state, from my mind, is essential, but a Palestinian state can't be created if Palestinians don't assume the responsibilities of statehood, don't build the institutions that would make it a state that could succeed. If a Palestinian state was created tomorrow, it would be a failed state. We don't need one more failed state in the Middle East.
Yeah, I hear you. Last question. You recently wrote regarding a possible nuclear deal with Iran, quote, allowing the Iranians to enrich to 60% while allowing them to make their nuclear facilities invulnerable to attack amounts to the United States fundamentally altering its approach to the Middle East. Instead of seeking to prevent Iran from going nuclear, as it has up until now, the United States would be tacitly shifting to a policy of accepting Iran's nuclear status and relying on deterrence. It would be shifting from a policy of prevention to a policy of containment. I think those words are spot on. Is there, well, what do you think? Is that where the administration is going? Have people given up trying to prevent Iran from going nuclear?
Well, I wrote it because I'm looking at the reality. I'm looking at the trajectory. And I know the administration would like things to be, I'd like to put Iran in a shelf and put it in a drawer. I know they want to have calm between now and the end of 2024. My worry is that the administration, in its own mind, still has a prevention policy, but the trajectory of Iran is that it is inevitably moving towards containment because we're not doing anything to affect that trajectory. It isn't to say it's too late, but it is to say the Iranians don't believe we'll ever act militarily against them, regardless of what they do. Now, they're not rushing to a bomb because they think, okay, let's not test fate. But if we just stay on the track we're on, we'll get to the point where we'll have the kind of invulnerability that can't stop us anyway. By the way, it's what the Supreme Leader said in this most recent speech. He said, we have a fatwa, we don't want, it's against our Islamic principles to have a bomb, but if we wanted a bomb, they couldn't stop us. And right now, when he says that, I think he actually believes it. He's not just saying it for effect, although he is saying it for effect, but because everything he's seeing from us, they're at 60%. Okay, 60% is already, it's not just that it's close to weapons grade. You could create a crude device at 60%. They have 114 kilograms that's been enriched to 60%. That's the equivalent of about 5 bombs worth. Instead of 25 or 26 kilograms, when you were at 90%, at 60%, 41 to 45, it would take about 41 to 45 kilograms. But you could have a crude device. Making 60% somehow acceptable already says to the Iranians, if we just build facilities that are sufficiently invulnerable, we'll be able to have a bomb at a time we're choosing. So it's not too late, but we have to change the Iranian calculus. And I laid out in that article that you're referring to, I laid out a number of steps that would have to be taken to convince them. Well, one is we should change our declaratory policy. They need to understand, they've spent 40 years investing in this infrastructure. They need to know we will destroy it. We could destroy it relatively quickly. Okay? Now, I don't want us to be in that position. I want to make war less likely, but I think if they don't believe that we do that, we're making it more likely, because even if we may be even unknowingly, unconsciously, tacitly moving towards containment, Israel is not going to accept a circumstance. And this is across the board. This is, Israel is rent by great division today, but not on this issue. Israel is not going to accept a situation where it loses a military option, and yet it will face an existential threat. So if you want to reduce the chance that Israel will act, the Iranian calculus has to change, and the path they're on has to be reversed. And in a sense, what I was arguing is, in some ways, maybe the administration isn't even facing up to the reality of where I think that the trend is leading. So there are things we could do. They're not simple things. The politics here don't exactly lend themselves to making it look like, you're rattling your sabers. But if you want to avoid a war, you actually have to do that. Accelerating what we provide the Israelis in terms of aerial refueling tankers, KC-46s, which the Israelis would need to carry out more effective strikes. That's a decision you have to make. It means, ironically, these are tankers that are supposed to go to our Air Force, and you might have to put the Israelis first in the queue. Giving the Israelis munitions that are better at penetrating really hardened targets is something we would need to do. having exercises where we rehearse, and the Iranians can see us rehearsing attacks against hardened targets. It's a way to reinforce the words. Reacting in a fashion that is tougher when their Shia proxies, are hitting our forces in Iraq and Syria. You have to, in my view, the Iranians are prepared to fight to the last of their proxies. They're sensitive when you hit them. So, take a page from the Israeli playbook. They have training camps for all these Shia militias. They're financed and trained by the Iranians. The training camps are in Iran. Hit the training camps. Do it in the middle of the night. You don't have to admit it. Don't put the Iranians in a position where they lose face if they don't respond, but they'll get the message. The point is, there are things that can be done that can change the Iranian calculus, which will allow us to preserve prevention and reduce the risk of war. The problem is, you have to make yourself credible on being willing to use the force to convince them that they're on a path that is too risky as they define risk.
Dennis, thank you so much for your time today. It has been fascinating and really informative to get into the weeds of some of these issues. There's not a lot of optimism out there, but I think we need to face the future with knowledge, and you've helped us do that. So thank you very much.
It was my pleasure, and I'm glad I was finally able to get together with you.
So cheers. Thank you.
All right, take care. All right, bye-bye.